Welcome to Lectionary Call-In for Tuesday, July 6th of 2021, where two laypersons, a pastor and an academician, gather for about 50 minutes each week to discuss the Gospel Lectionary for the coming Sunday and the Sunday of July 11th. Each Tuesday we call in from wherever we may be at 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time, and for our good friend Charles Willard in Minnesota, that's 5:30 a.m. Our little team's working to be faithful to Lectionary Year B, and we hope this discussion will provide areas of focus and reflection. Here's how it works. We develop perspectives independently after the leadoff person shares some formative questions, and then in this virtual discussion room we share, encourage, and challenge each other. And here are all the folks joining us in today's discussion.
Bill Hall in St. Petersburg, Florida.
Sarah Mickelson in Tampa, Florida.
Charles, you're on mute. And that's Charles Willard in Minnesota. Good to have you with us. And I'm Don Upton. And if you're watching on Zoom, I'm in any airport, USA this morning. And to kick things off today, I'll go ahead and read the scripture and then ask the opening question. I'm going to read from Mark 6:14 through 29. And I'm going to read from the New Revised Standard Version. King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Some were saying John the Baptizer had been raised from the dead. For this reason, these powers are at work in him. But others said, it is Elijah. And others said, it is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. For Herod himself had sent men who arrested John, bound him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because Herod had married her. For John had been telling Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. And Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he protected him. And when he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he liked to listen to him. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for the courtiers and officers and for the leaders of Galilee. And when the daughter Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guest. And the king said to the girl, ask me whatever you wish, and I will give it. And he solemnly swore to her, whatever you ask me, I will give you, even half of my kingdom. And she went out and said to her mother, what should I ask for? She replied, the head of John the Baptizer. Immediately she rushed back to the king and requested, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. The king was deeply grieved, yet out of regard for his oaths and for the guests, he did not want to refuse her. Immediately the king sent a soldier of the guard with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in prison. He brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. And when his disciples heard about it, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. And that's the word of the Lord. Well, this is a brutal passage, difficult to read, and also I think interesting because it states an inquiry about who is Jesus, and then backtracks very quickly to explain what's been going on. And to kick things off, I've got a question, and heads up, Sarah Mickelson, I'll start with you. And this goes back to the front end of this passage. Who is Jesus is the question that leads us into the story, the backtracking of the story of John the Baptist and his incarceration and the killing of John. So what do you make of the search for the reasons why Jesus has these powers and the reality of who he may be? What do you make of this search for why Jesus has these powers? Sarah?
So interesting to me that the why is tied to the who do you say Jesus is question. Even more so, that this passage presents us with the same answers to the same question that the disciples give when Jesus asks them, "Who do you say that I am?" Or who are people saying that I am? And so Herod's reasoning, as he considers who Jesus might be and about Jesus having these powers, are all very rooted in human explanations. And I think framed by a bit of a corrupted thought. Herod considers Jesus an extension of John because that's what he fears and yet yearns for the most. It's interesting that the gospel accounts don't agree about how Herod feels about John the Baptist. It's curious to me that in other gospels, Herod considers John persona non grata and hunts him down. And maybe we're getting two perspectives on the same actions, but it seems like from a perspective of Herod's that he considers Greek thought in his account of resurrecting or being born again, if you will, of John the Baptist. So he throws that idea onto Jesus and says Jesus is John resurrected or born again. So I find that curious because in that thinking, it implies that Jesus is from the same school of thought, or implies that Jesus is not specifically John raised from the dead, but John's ideas and belief systems resurrected and raised from the dead. So I find that curious because in our thinking, John is the a herald for Jesus and not Jesus the herald for John. So the why, I think, in Herod's mind is I think in a narcissistic perspective, Herod believes that Jesus has come back to point the finger at Herod again. And I think from our perspective, there's something bigger at play. So Herod's thinking, specifically that Jesus is going to be the same person, the same character of Herod, of John. So that's the why I think Jesus has these powers and the reality of who he may be are all framed up by the corrupted thinking of Herod. That's my first blush on this. I'll give it that.
Thank you. Bill Hull, the search for why. What do you make of it?
A challenging question, Don, and my thinking is a work in progress. First of all, I'll note, as Sarah noted for us, this account is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's in Mark 6, Matthew 14, Luke 9. And it's interesting. I don't know if this speaks to your question or not, but it's interesting to me in each of those three what happens just before this account. And in Mark, which we're looking at, as we know from last week, he commissioned the 12, and they went out, and many were cured. And what follows it, which we'll look at next week, is the feeding of the 5,000. So the frame is the disciples are not out challenging the Roman government. They're out healing people. And what follows is Jesus feeds hungry people. In Matthew, what precedes it is Jesus' rejection at Nazareth, which we looked at recently. And it ends by saying he wasn't able to do many good deeds in their presence. And then Luke somewhat mirrors Mark in that he's commissioning the 12 and they go curing diseases. Now, yesterday on the Followers of the Way, Kenny Hubble shared something I had not heard, and I haven't had the time to research it. he was saying that according to some scholars, they think that this Herod was very much under the influence of Greek thinking. And one of the implications, Kenny quoted the scholars as saying, is that there was a belief, at least among some Greeks, that if you came back, resurrected or however, you were even more powerful than in your previous life. So that if Herod was under that influence, we can understand the depth of his fear of what he would. If he thought that Jesus was John the Baptist resurrected, then if he thought John was a thorn in his flesh, then his fear could be that Jesus will even be more so. And I will say more about this in the subsequent questions, but I've really been pondering that here is this Roman leader with all the power that went with being in that position. It's demonstrated that he had the power almost on a whim to order someone being beheaded. Someone that powerful fears someone who is healing, but we're also told that John had, to use today's terminology, John the Baptist spoke truth to power. He challenged Herod. And you're right, Sarah, as I was listening to you, I forget exactly how you said it, but that the other synoptics say that, well, in Matthew it says Herod wanted to put him to death. He feared the crowd because they regarded him as a prophet. So that it's, and then in Luke it said, it simply says, Herod said, I beheaded John, who then is this? So we get some complexity, because in Mark it talks about that, and we'll get to this, that the protection. In any event, to me, Herod comes across as very conflicted and lets himself get, as it were, trapped into keeping the crowd pleased and his wife and her daughter by ordering the death of a person. So I think what primarily motivated this search, John, was great fear. Fear that somehow Herod might still be confronted and challenged. But I'm still puzzling. So I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you. I've been trying to figure out, what is basic human nature and what, in this terrible story and this search. I think power is coming into this, and I can't get behind that culture of the time, but when someone exerts power, it's the human nature to figure out not just where does it come from, but what are the risks? Where can it go? How can it flow? And I was this year thinking about two things that Herod seems to be doing. One is, for human nature, when someone is exhibiting unusual or excellent or fantastic behavior, and I don't know them. And I'll just ask any listener, all of you, my colleagues, to think about how you would react to that. You kind of want to cut to the chase and see what it's all about. I don't know who they are, but they are, I'm in an airport today, and I'm going to walk past hundreds, if not thousands of people. I'm going to have my head down. Nothing's going to particularly jump out, unless something unusual or excellent or fantastic takes place. And then my mind's going to start racing. And I want to figure out what that is. And it can be very superficial because we're starting at zero. And in this case, here's a newcomer on the scene, Jesus. And who is that? So we start way up here. But on the other hand, there's this intimate situation that, Sarah, I think you were referring to, which is if it is John, then it's more like somebody from your own hometown. And just a week ago, we're talking about Jesus in his hometown. That's not someone exhibiting the unknown person, the unusual. This is the known person. I know who it is. And so in many cases, don't I understand them because I know their parents or their code of conduct? What's that all about? So I'm seeing Herod kind of on both tracks. Who's the outsider named Jesus? Can they be controlled? What are they about? Where's the power come from? And then on the other hand, in Herod's mind, Jesus is transformed to someone who has an intimate knowledge of him, someone that is known. And it's both. And it's interesting that, even though Jesus is connected with John, in this interpretation Herod's giving, Jesus, I guess, isn't directly connected. So Jesus can be created in Herod's mind as a newcomer or someone that's been reborn. So there's no direct connection. What I'm trying to get to is, I think it's both. That we've got Jesus, newcomer, power, excellence, fantastic, unusual. Where does this power come from? And then at the same time, intimate, as if family, as if hometown, someone that knows me. It's both. All things new, Jesus, in this case, that I think it reflects what the gospel and the Christ is really about. It is new. It is a new way, I'm quoting the letters, but it's intimate at the same time. And where Herod is caught is what he wants the most is to evade. Evasion is the agenda. If it's a newcomer, stay away from him. If it's someone that has an intimate knowledge of my behavior, I want to stay away from them. What is Jesus? All things new together. How about you, Charles? What do you think about this? And you're on mute.
Thank you for reminding me. I think it's very unusual. I had never read the text this closely before, but when I see in verse 16, when Herod heard of this, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised, almost as I won't say a casual observation, but that strikes me as a really weird thing to say. I mean, why would you assume that sort of thing? And I don't have an answer for that, so I'm still puzzling over it. But for Herod to have said that, which is basically repeating what others had said, at least as is reported here, but for Jesus to even become known, some were saying John the Baptizer has been raised from the dead, and for that reason these powers are at work in him. If Herod really thinks that that's the case, then if I were Herod, I would be a deeply troubled person. I mean, I would say, what have I gotten myself into? But Mark doesn't disclose that to us. Mark simply makes that as a kind of an aside and then goes on. And the casual way that, somebody being raised from the dead and coming back in this particular form, it's almost as though it's an everyday experience, but we know it's not. So I'm in the midst of puzzlement instead of having gotten a puzzle and then been able to work it out and say, here's the answer. I don't have the answer at this point. I just have the puzzle.
I have a question. Do you think that Herod is expressing the idea that I had power over John because I killed him, and yet here is in his mind John coming back, which is evidence that he had no power over John? It could be this moment of, but I killed you, why are you back? If you want to play that trope we see played it often in movies, as I saw you die, and yet you're back, which indicates that Herod's power is hollow, which would be very frightening to Herod, to me. I just thought I'd throw that out.
That's really interesting. I was thinking about that this week too, Sarah, and and I could play it both ways. It's the same idea, but and I'll use this to kind of kick off the next question: is when you when you want to evade, in the case of the story of Herod, you not only can make things go away, you can kill it. And once you kill something, it may be that people that follow, people that get retribution, people that see you as a martyr, but really the person is set aside. You can evade by killing somebody. And what does it take is not John, but the new. The fact is, it's not John. So I'm with you on one path, and on the other, it's like John cannot do that. It is the Christ that's coming back, who makes sure that the story isn't forgotten at all. He cannot kill the story. Many stories are lost in history, but this one will not be lost because the new comes back. And let's use that for the next question, Bill Hull. What is the royal protection in verse 20 in this? This royal, there's a kind of he's talking to himself. It's like he's going to protect him. And there are lots of royal protections, so-called protections, in the gospel and scripture. So what is this royal protection in the face of the gospel? What are your thoughts about that?
First of all, thank you for the question. I had not focused on this before. Let me remind us of the larger context in which that word is used. We've already noted that John had challenged Herod for marrying Herod's brother's wife. And then it says in verse 19, Herodias, and I'm going to insert names so that we can keep track of who we're talking about. Herodias had a grudge against John and wanted to kill John, but she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and Herod protected John. When Herod heard John, he was greatly perplexed, and yet Herod liked to listen to John. There is a level of complexity here, especially, Sarah, going back to the other gospel accounts that don't soften it. They only present Herod as hating John. It seems to me this has the ring of reality. My fantasy is, and I can't prove this, that on the one hand, Herod greatly resented John for calling him out, but that there was some level of respect or perhaps some level of recognition of the truth of what John said. I think that has a ring of reality. None of us like to be called out, even on a simple level. So I can understand that, and it can escalate to the point you want to kill someone. But to say, and Don, it doesn't tell us what Herod did to protect John, except my fantasy is, and I don't mean to be flippant, Herod's got a wife undoubtedly in his ear saying, get rid of this guy. And yet Herod is dealing with some part of himself within that, for whatever reason, doesn't want to kill John. And the part of it, we're told, because Herod feared the crowd. John the Baptist had some popularity, and Jesus did. And so, again, there are layers of complexity here. And Herod had the power both to protect John and ultimately to destroy him. And we are cautioned at times not to become moralistic and to see Herod as a monster over against us. We are not monsters. I think I can see something of myself in this, not to the extent of killing someone, but again, that conflictedness of someone calling us out accurately, and on one level we recognize the truth in it, on the other level we want to resist it. And I think in our relationship with Christ, That is a constant battle. We've talked before about how much do we resist the gospel? How much do we resist Jesus's ethic challenging how we live our lives? Now, if my response sounds a little muddled, it's because I am not sure. And to get to one of my little things, I engage in muddling and mulling. Both are going home with this on. With that, I'll pass the baton off.
Thank you. Lots of royal protections. They don't hold up very well through Scripture, Sarah. What do you think about this one?
I think we're seeing something at play here that we see even today in our world. When you don't like what's being said and you have power, you figure out a way to control who hears that message and control what the message is that's broadcast. We might call this the silencing of speaking truth to power. So royal protection looks like being imprisoned. Royal protection looks like you don't get to have the public forum to have a dialogue anymore. You get my message. You get if you will, retreaded or edited speech. Like, well, John said this, and then Herod said this, and you only get the version that Herod wants you to hear. So, royal protection is not protection. Royal protection is being censored. Royal protection is being imprisoned. Royal protection means you don't have the mouthpiece you used to have. Your followers don't have the leadership they used to have. So I think Herod is indeed living into the language we've been given for him is a wily fox. He's figured out how to get the rooster away from the hen, so to speak, if we're going to play the fox in the hen house conversation, to control the message. And he may be interested in what John has to say, but I don't know that he's interested in changing his behavior or, doing what I would consider a Dickensian turn. I think he's more interested in sustaining his own power and living into the hedonistic world that he's created for himself. And John called him out on that. And John said, hey, this isn't right. You're not supposed to marry your niece. You're not supposed to do these things. And, Herod, interestingly enough, didn't like being told that your behavior is out of bounds, like any other person. And wanted John to stop, but yet he was fascinated that John could to talk from a perspective of authenticity with some power. I think that's what was fascinating to Herod, that John had the audacity to continue. That's what I think royal protection looks like.
Thank you. And I'm thinking about other gospels where we even see another king going, oh, I'll keep him safe, but tell me where the child is so I can go and worship him. Or later in Mark, there's an arrest, and there are some implied protections in the arrest as well. Charles Willard, what about you? Any thoughts about the so-called royal protection here?
I was more thinking, what happened when Herod and his wife and his daughter got home that night? It must have been a wild scene. I mean, but that's all. I have no more contribution.
Thank you. Well, the final question is, Sarah, I'll take this to you first, is the gospel's filled with meals, often dealing with celebration and traditions. This one's, of course, a very difficult meal to deal with. Dare we ask how this so-called celebratory meal and the passing of the platter reveals the real truths in the Mark story? Sarah?
I couldn't help but work this through a compare and contrast with the other celebrations that when you teed up the question, my brain went, what other celebratory meals have we seen? And I thought the wedding at Canaan. I thought the supper that Jesus hosts before he's arrested. I thought about the feeding of 5,000, which chases this story. I thought about those kinds of meals, and they have a very different tenor, a very different tone. This celebration seems to be more about aggrandizement. It seems to be more about worshiping Herod. So he invites everybody in, the couriers, and I would say the society reporters, if you will, if we were to transpose it a little bit and make it more modern. And the people around Herod are not really trustworthy. They're just people around Herod because he has power and they want power. Or they owe him for their power. I think that there's a really interesting father-daughter dynamic being shown to us in this story. We have that in contrast sharply to the story of Jairus and his daughter being healed. Jairus' daughter and Herod's daughter are both 12. The same word is used to describe their ages, which is kind of strange. In Jairus' case, he's approaching Jesus for healing and for the restoration of her life. In Herod's story, I don't know that he cares at all about this daughter. He invites her to put on a show in front of everyone. And that's very, in this culture, it might be considered extravagant. And it might be considered, taking advantage of the virtues of your daughter by putting her on display. So I'm not quite sure how to read that. I think that Herod's dining experience is more hedonistic. It's about momentary pleasures. It's about the tasting of the food. It's about drinking too much. It's about staying up all night. It's about indulgences versus something you do that celebrates the relationship you have to the people around you. And so I see it in contrast to the wedding at Canaan being a very strong difference of the people around Herod don't care about Herod. They just are there because they need to be making appearances, where people at the wedding of Canaan are coming because they care about the couple. They care about the two families coming together. They care about the relationships that they're having, and that is the most important reason for celebration. I think that the whole story is a corruption, a contrast of what humanity looks like in relationship to what the kingdom of heaven looks like. And oftentimes, and I think we're going to see this play out in the rest of the gospel, humanity wants to reject that which is disruptive. And the gospel that Jesus is bringing is going to be considered disruptive on multiple levels. And so we have a very human situation presented to us by this particular celebration with Herod, topping out with the murder of John the Baptist and the gory presentation of that particular act being presented as if it's one of the finishing courses of the meal. It's just, ugh. And I think that that's an indication of humanity left to its own devices is going to go as far as it can go in the wrong direction. And that we see this in Herod's meal, his celebratory meal, and the way he presents the platter, as if this is the food we're going to dine on, which is such a sharp contrast to the resurrection meal. This is my body broken for you, take and eat. So for me, it's just an aberration of what God has intended.
Thank you. I think I've heard people in the past going, do we really, I think in my question I said, do we dare? And the reason I put it that way is I think I've heard in the past, like, do we really have to go there all the way to the meal? And the author of Mark says, yeah, it's necessary. It's necessary to set that out. Bill Hull, what do you think? Celebratory meal here.
Well, again, to refresh our memory of context, in verse 21 it says, but when an opportunity came when Herod on his birthday gave a banquet for his courtiers and officers and for the leaders of Galilee. These are the rich and famous. These are the powerful. And Sarah has alluded, I mentioned earlier that in Mark's account, what follows is Jesus feeding the 5,000. Herod's banquet is self-serving and limited. Jesus' serving is generous and inclusive. There are 5,000 people here. Let's feed all of them. No, let's figure out who's Jewish and who's Gentile or males separated from females, whatever division they could have used. So the contrast is stark, to put it mildly. Now, I found a quote from Brian Stoppergen to be helpful, and I want to read it and then comment on it. He writes, a contrast could be made between these two sending out events. Jesus sends his followers out to bring health and wholeness to the life of others. Herod sends his employees out to destroy the life of another. The context also suggests this contrast. Herod can throw a large party for important people. The 12 are sent out with no bread, no bag, and no money. Herod has everything. The disciples have nothing. Again, to put it mildly, a stark contrast. Now, I think it also speaks to this. We often, especially as Presbyterians, we want to be nonpartisan, which is a worthy goal. And there's this debate over, do we get into politics or not? The Bible certainly gets into politics. I mean, it runs throughout. Who ends up destroying the life of Jesus? The Romans, encouraged by the religious leadership. So we're presented with the power of empire to nurture life. The Romans did a lot of good things, but it's also a reminder that empire can be very destructive. And I mentioned before this recording began that I got an article this morning, an excerpt from a book on the Roman Empire. And just to illustrate how this could spin itself out, according to this scholar, now this is in a time period a good bit later than what we're looking at. This author says that from 211 to 285, there were 26 emperors. One died of an epidemic. Another died fighting the Germans. A third was captured by the Persians. 23 died violently at the hands of Romans. So empire can be internally destructive, the assassinations, and again, I don't know all the details. While it may almost seem like an exaggerated contrast, I think it is very relevant today. Is the purpose of government to nurture life and sustain and protect life, or in effect to destroy it? And I think we're in a battle with that over the environment, over immigration, whatever issue you want to talk. And again, this is not, when we're at our best, those are not partisan issues. It's an issue of what is the purpose of government. As I understand it, the word politics in its root means managing the life of a city. Polis is the Greek word for city. So politics are inevitable because life needs to be managed. Jesus managed the 12 who followed him. So Jesus's meals, we remember he ate with sinners, with tax collectors. The meal for Jesus was an opportunity to be inclusive. And there are parables about a king is throwing a banquet, people don't show up, and so the orders, well, go out to the highways and byways, and it's like bring anyone in. And I think that's the image of the kingdom, that it is open to everyone. And empire ends up being exclusion, exclusion, and ultimately destruction. But again, Don, when I listen to myself, I think I'm still a bit muddled. But your questions have stimulated a lot of thinking. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And the temptation I have always had is to evade this meal when the author of Mark is saying, you need to meditate on this meal, as horrible as it is. And if you're listening in or watching on Zoom and you're preparing to teach or moderate a class or some discussion, just I think setting the two meals, the royal meal of Christ and this meal side by side does have breakthroughs and have light in it. It's not all darkness, because on one hand, we've got a meal that is, now think about this. Would you have a meal, your family, a reunion, a holiday, or just a gathering in the evening that was built around revenge, setting an example for other people, erasing history, erasing a human being, and evading facts? Would you have a meal like that? Does that ever creep in any way? This does with a vengeance. A meal built on forgetting. In other words, killing someone so that we can forget the words that were said in the past. And forgive how rude this is, but dismembering someone so that it can go away, that person is no longer whole. It's a dinner of revenge and erasure, which means it's not about remembrance. Now, if you're in a class, say, all right, what is the holy meal? What does the meal with Christ look like? And I just want to pull out a few words that contradict the ones I just gave you. One would be Christ's meals were about nourishment. We need to live, even feeding the thousands on a hillside. You need to eat. Disciples say they need to be taken care of. We need to be nourished together so that we may live another day, so that we may converse, so that we may sleep soundly. We need to have a meal so that we can have a conversation with each other, because that matters to the Christ. So that we are connected. And I mean that in the rudest way, because John is no longer connected. That we are connected to life and service and love. And that Jesus, think about the ends of many of the Gospels, that Jesus' presence is made whole with the meals. In some cases, him being present with the disciples. He's whole. He is solid. He is the Son of Man. Touch me. He eats fish on the beach. The relationships are made whole. So there's the idea of broken and wholeness. This is my body broken for you. John's body is broken. Jesus' body is broken in a different way. The new I made, he makes all things new. So things are whole. And then finally, the revolutions that take place at meals. Forward-looking. Christ tells a story about who should sit at the head of the table, right? Last become first at the dinner table. These revolutions. So there's Herod trying to end history, end the facts, put an end to it. And here, at a different kind of dynamic table, all these things can take place. And then for our table that we all deal with constantly, the communion table, remembrance. Remembrance is possible. Death doesn't end the ability to remember. It's all things new. Charles Willer, how about you? What do you think about this meal? And you're on mute, Charles.
Thank you.
Yep.
Charles, we can't hear you, brother. So I'm going to step in. If you could see if you could take yourself off mute, that would be great. And Sarah, I'm not hearing. Are you?
I'm not hearing him.
Okay. Let's give it one more try. No. Well, that's a shame. And so for those of you just listening on podcast, Charles is moving his arms like timeout, won't be able to do it, and I'm very sorry we're not able to hear you. Let me just go back to Bill and Sarah, see if there's any follow-up before we say goodbye. Any follow-up thoughts?
I'm wondering about this oath that Herod makes, that he will give this child anything she wants up into half of his kingdom. And the unlikely or the discomforting thing here is then he's invited everybody else to play judge in the room. If he doesn't fulfill the promise, he has no retreat. So it's interesting the wily fox has been caught by his own language in that he has to take the head of John because she asks for it in a public forum. And so he's given away the power to her. And that's curious to me that he now puts himself in a box.
Charles, did I hear you come back on? See if you're on the line
now. Yes,
came
back on.
Yes,
I think so.
That is happy news. We hear you loud and clear. So I was turning to you for your thoughts about this meal.
Well, what I was saying was that it was it's unimaginable. Somebody as powerful as Herod. But I mean, in the first place, how would Mark know what this conversation was about? Where would he have learned that? Secondly, it's unimaginable that somebody like Herod would be drawn into something like that. And what did they do with the head once it got there? Did they all pass it around and take a look at it? Did they leave it on the table? Did it just come in and go out? I mean, when John's disciples came, did they get the body and the head, or only the body? I'm stuck in the middle of quandaries.
Thank you. I share your quandaries as well, but there's something there for me, in that the story survives. The whole point for me, the point was, can we wipe out remembrance? No, not possible. Even that story, Mark begins with John's the voice in the wilderness, right? Isn't that how Mark begins? It's not the story of the birth of Christ. There's the voice crying out in the wilderness, and here we are in a certain kind of wilderness. Bill Hull, we need to go here in a second, but let me see if you have any last words for us.
Real quickly, springboarding off of what I heard Sarah last say, this to me is a powerful contemporary reminder that we set our leaders up. We want them to be people pleasers, but this is a graphically powerful story of the dangers of being consumed by people pleasing. It is a trap that we set for ourselves, and yet we contribute to it by wanting our leaders to please us.
Yeah, it reminds me, something that comes up almost every day with me, in my own heart, and with my clients. Who are you talking to? Who's your audience? Well, this is why I'm like, who? Are you talking to yourself? Who's in there with you? What's going on? And I think about and I've got that challenge myself. Sometimes I'm doing things and I'm wondering, who am I talking to? Who's my real audience? Well, For folks that are listening in or watching on Zoom, Palmacia Presbyterian Church is at 3501 West San Jose Street. That's in Tampa, Florida. And for more information, you can go to palmacia.org. That's PALMACEIA.org. We commend that site to you because there are discussions of the same passages. We don't always agree, and if you want to see more disagreements or agreements, look at those sites. Great sermons, reflections, prayer, and outstanding music. And you're always welcome, and we'll see you next time.